It was a warm Thursday evening when I decided to come home early from my business trip. The meeting had wrapped up sooner than expected, so I thought I'd surprise Bart. I had a small bouquet of flowers in one hand and a bottle of her favorite wine in the other as I pulled into the driveway. I felt a surge of excitement. I imagined the smile on her face when she saw me. I quietly unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was silent except for the tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I placed the flowers. I found a bottle of wine on the kitchen counter and made my way upstairs, trying not to make a sound. Our bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I could see the soft glow of the bedside lamp spilling into the hallway. My heart skipped a beat as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. What I saw was like a punch to the gut. Tangled in the sheets of our bed was my wife Barb with another man. They were both sound asleep, completely unaware of my presence. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes. This couldn't be real. This had to be a dream. This must be a nightmare, Barb, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Neither of them stirred. I stood there, frozen, watching them breathe. My mind was racing. I wanted to scream and throw them out of my house, but a strange calm washed over me instead. I turned and walked out of the room, down the stairs and into the garage. Among my tools was a pair of handcuffs I had bought as a joke years ago. I grabbed them and headed back upstairs. My heart was pounding in my chest. Back in the bedroom, I approached the bed. Bart was lying there. On her back, her arm draped over the man's chest with trembling hands. I gently fastened one cuff around her wrist and the other to the headboard. She fumbled something in her sleep but didn't wake. I moved to the other side of the bed and did the same to the man. I'd secured both of them in handcuffs. I stepped back and took a deep breath. My hands were shaking, but I felt a cold, focused determination. I picked up the bedside lamp and held it above Barb's head. "Wake up, Barb," I said, my voice steady but filled with pain. Her eyes fluttered. She opened her eyes and looked around, confused for a moment. Then she saw the handcuffs and the lamp in my hand, and her eyes widened in fear. "Jerry, what are you doing?" she gasped, trying to pull her hand free. I didn't answer. I turned to the man and said, "Wake up." He groaned. He opened his eyes and looked around, confused. "Who are you?" he demanded, trying to sit up but failing because of the handcuffs. "I'm Jerry," I said coldly, "Bard's husband." The man's face turned pale. "Oh God," he muttered. "Please, Jerry," Barb pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "It's not what it looks like," I laughed bitterly. "It looks like my wife is in bed with another man." "Jerry, I'm sorry. Please let's talk about this." I shook my head, feeling the weight of the situation crushing me. "There's nothing to talk about, Barb. You made your choice, and now you have to face the consequences." I walked to the dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside was my revolver, a .35 Magnum. I took it out and turned to face them. Barb's eyes widened in terror. "Jerry, no," she whispered. "Please don't do this." I ignored her. "You've made your choice. Now you have to face the consequences." I walked to the dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside was my revolver, a .35 Magnum. I took it out and turned to face them. Barb's eyes widened in terror. "Jerry, please don't do this," she whispered. I ignored her. I looked at the man and asked, "What's your name?" "Bob," he replied, his voice trembling. "Well, Bob," I said, "let's play a little game." Barb started to cry harder. "Jerry, please don't do this," she pleaded. "I'm begging you," I said, taking a deep breath and looking at them. I felt a strange sense of calm. I felt a sense of calm as I began to explain the rules of the game. It hit me then that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about making them feel the fear and helplessness I felt. It was about taking control of a situation that had ripped my life apart. So with my heart heavy and my mind set, I prepared to deliver the consequences of their betrayal. Barb's scream pierced the silence of the night. She jolted awake, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized her wrist was handcuffed to the headboard next to her. Bob Simmons groaned and tried to sit up, only to find his wrist also bound. He yanked at the handcuff and cried out in pain as the metal dug into his skin. "Jerry, what are you doing?" Barb's voice was high. She was crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she was shaking. I was standing at the foot of the bed with a gun in my hand. My heart was racing. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Did you two sleep well?" Jerry asked. "Oh my God," Barb said, her voice breaking. "It's not what it looks like." "I'm sorry," I said, shaking my head. "It looks like my wife is in bed with another man." Bob, his face pale, tried to speak. "Jerry, listen, we can talk about this. Just put the gun down." I turned my gaze to him with a look of pure contempt. I asked him to talk about what Bob had done. I asked him how he'd been screwing my wife. I asked him how he'd destroyed everything I'd believed in. Bob swallowed hard. His eyes darted to the revolver in my hand. He said it was a mistake. It was just a mistake, he said. It just happened. Please don't do anything rash. This is a mistake. I echoed my voice. This is a mistake. It's like spilling coffee on your shirt. This is a betrayal. Barb sobbed, her tears soaking the pillow. Jerry, please put the gun down. We can work through this. I still love you. I felt a surge of anger and heartbreak. We can work through this. You were in bed with another man. How do you expect us to work through this? To work through that? She shook her head and her voice trembled. It meant nothing. It was a moment of weakness. Please let's talk about this. We can fix it. I laughed again, but there was no humor in it. How do you fix something like this? You broke my trust. You broke my heart. Bob still tried to pull at the handcuffs. He tried to reason with me. Jerry, listen. You don't. We need to do this. You don't want to go to jail over this. I looked at him, my eyes cold. Jail? You think I'm worried about jail right now? You should be worried about what I'm going to do to you. I opened the cylinder of the revolver and showed them the single bullet. Their eyes widened in fear. This is a .35 Magnum cartridge. I explained. If this hits you, it will create. It'll make you bleed out. We're going to play a little game of Russian roulette. Barb started crying, then turned into desperate cries. Jerry, please don't do this. I'm begging you. I ignored her and spun the cylinder, snapping it back into place. Let's start with you, Bob, I said, pointing the gun at him. Bob's face turned ashen, and he closed his eyes. Please don't. I pulled. The trigger snapped, and the hammer fell on an empty chamber. Bob let out a shuddering breath, his relief palpable. Looks like you got lucky, I said, my tone cold. Then I turned the gun on Barb. Your turn, I said, my voice calm. Barb's eyes were wide with terror, her body shaking uncontrollably. Jerry, please, she said, her voice shaking. I love you. Don't do this. Do you think God will forgive you? I asked, cocking the gun. You think you deserve mercy? She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Snap. The hammer fell on an empty chamber again. I smiled bitterly. Looks like fate is on your side today. I lowered the gun, feeling the strange sense of calm wash over me. They were terrified, just as I had been terrified when I walked into this room. But there I thought fear would bring me satisfaction, but it only made me feel emptier. Why, Barb? I asked quietly, my voice breaking. Why did you do this to us? She looked at me, her eyes filled with sorrow. I don't know, Jerry. I was lonely. I made a horrible mistake. Please let's talk about this. I shook my head, feeling the weight of betrayal crushing me. There's nothing left to talk about, Barb. You made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequences. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. What was I going to do now? How could I move forward from this? But one thing was clear. Our marriage was over. There was no going back from this. The room was heavy with tension, the kind that wraps around your throat and makes it hard to breathe. Breathe, Barb. Bob and Barb were handcuffed to the bed. Their eyes were wide with fear. I stood at the foot of the bed, the revolver in my hand, feeling like an extension of my anger and betrayal. Jerry, please, Barb begged. Her voice was shaking. You don't have to do this. I looked at her. My heart was aching. Why, Barb? Why did you do this to us to me? She shook her head, tears streaming. I don't know. I was lonely. I made a terrible mistake. Please let's talk about this. I echoed bitterly. You want to talk now, after everything? Bob tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. Jerry, listen. We can figure this out. Just put the gun down. I ignored him and focused on Barb. You know, I used to love gambling. I said, my voice calm. I gave it up, because I loved you more, but tonight we're going to play a little game of chance. I opened the revolver cylinder and showed them the single bullet. Barb gasped, her face turning pale. No, Jerry, please, she whispered. I spun the cylinder, the clicking sound echoing in the silence. Let's see how lucky you really are, I said, pointing the gun at Bob. Please, Jerry, don't. He pleaded, his voice trembling. What's the matter, Bob? I asked, my tone cold. You were so brave, sneaking around with my wife. Where's that bravery now? He closed his eyes, his body shaking. I pulled the trigger, the hammer falling on an empty chamber. Bob was out of breath. He didn't notice he was holding the gun, but his relief was short-lived. I turned the gun on Barb. Your turn, Barb. I said. She was crying softly, her body trembling. Jerry, I love you. Please don't do this. Do you really love me? Because it doesn't feel like it. I pulled the trigger, and the gun made a loud noise. Another empty chamber. I could see fear in Bar's eyes, mixed with a glimmer of hope. Maybe she thought I was bluffing, or maybe she thought I didn't have it in me to really hurt. I turned back to Bob. My grip tightened on the gun. I said, Bob, I see why you do it. Why do you prey on married women? He swallowed hard and sweat dripped down his face. It's the thrill, he admitted. The chase makes them feel special, like they're missing out on something. I asked, my wife. The surge of anger made me think that she was missing out on something with me. Jerry, please, Barb interrupted. This isn't helping. Let's just talk. I ignored her and kept my eyes on Bob. You think you're so clever, don't you? Playing your little games, but this time the game's on you. I spun the cylinder. Again, he pointed the gun at him. Ready for another round? Bob's eyes widened in terror. Jerry, please, I have a family. I don't want to die. I smiled coldly. You should have thought about that before you crawled into bed with my wife. I pulled the trigger, and another empty chamber appeared. Bob's body sagged with relief, but his eyes were still filled with fear. Looks like you're lucky tonight, I said, my voice flat. Luck runs out eventually. I turned back to Barb. You know, Barb, I really did love you. I would have done anything for you, but you threw it all away for this loser. She sobbed harder, her body shaking. Jerry, I'm so sorry. I know I messed up. Let's just talk about this. We can fix it. I shook my head, feeling the weight of my decision. There's nothing left to fix. Barb, you broke us. I raised the gun and pointed it at my own head. Maybe it would be easier to just end it all right now. Then you can be free to do whatever you want. No. Jerry looked at Barb, who was screaming and trying to break free from the handcuffs. Please don't do this, he thought. I looked at her, my heart aching with a mixture of love and pain. It's too late, Barb. The damage is done. I closed my eyes and pulled the trigger. Snap. Another empty chamber. I let out a shaky breath and lowered the gun. The room was silent. Apart from Barb's sobs and Bob's ragged breathing, I opened my eyes and looked at them. I felt a strange sense of calm, as if I'd reached the end of the game. I said quietly, the consequences are just beginning. I walked to the dresser, picked up the handcuff keys, and tossed them onto the bed. Unlock yourselves and get out of my house. I never want to see either of you again, Barb. She reached for the keys, her hand shaking. Jerry, please, she whispered. I still love you. I shook my head, feeling the tears welling up. It's over, Barb. Over. As they fumbled with the keys and freed themselves, I turned and walked out of the room, the revolver still in my hand. The weight of their betrayal was heavy on my shoulders, but I knew that this was the first step towards taking back control of my life. The room was still and silent after the intense confrontation. Barb and Bob had finally managed to free themselves from the handcuffs. They sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing their wrists. Their wrists were sore, and they avoided eye contact with each other and with me. The air was thick with unspoken words and RW emotions. I stood by the dresser, my grip on the revolver loosening slightly. The adrenaline rush was fading, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. I needed answers, some kind of closure. I turned to Bob, calm but cold. Why, Bob? Why do you do it? What makes you prey on married women? Bob looked up at me. His eyes were filled with regret and fear. He swallowed hard before speaking. It's the thrill, the chase, making them feel special, like they're missing out on something. And what about my wife? I asked, my voice trembling. With anger, did you think she was missing out on something with me? Bob looked down at his hands, unable to meet my gaze. I don't know. She seemed unhappy and lonely. I took advantage of that. I'm sorry, Barb. Still crying. She looked up at Bob with a mixture of anger and sadness. You took advantage of me, Bob. I was vulnerable, and you used that against me. I turned to Barb. My heart was breaking all over again. Why, Barb? Why did you let him? Why did you betray me? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, Jerry. I was feeling bloss, and Bob made me feel noticed. I know it's no excuse, but that's the truth. I took a deep breath. I'm trying to calm down and think clearly. Do you have any idea how much you've hurt me and how you've destroyed everything we built together, Barb? You're crying. I'm sorry, Jerry. I know I messed up. I don't know how to make it right. You can't. I said quietly, you can't undo what's been done. The room fell silent again. It felt like a weight. I looked at Bob. My anger was still there, but I kept it to myself. What about your family, Bob? What will they think when they find out what you've done? He looked up at me. His face was pale. Please, Jerry, don't tell them. I'll do anything. Just don't ruin their lives because of my mistakes. I laughed bitterly, and I ruined their lives. What about mine? What about Barb? You didn't think about that, did you? Bob shook his head, tears in his eyes. I was selfish. I know that now. Please, Jerry, don't punish them for what I did. I felt a surge of anger, but also a flicker of pity. I knew what it felt like to have your world turned upside down. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. I won't tell them, I said finally, but you need to leave, both of you. I can't stand to look at either of you right now. Bard looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. Jerry, please, can we at least try to fix this? I still love you. I shook my head, feeling the tears welling up again. It's too late, Barb. The trust is gone, and without trust, there's nothing left. She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Bob stood up, looking defeated. I'll go, he said quietly. I'm sorry, Jerry, for everything. He walked out of the room, leaving Barb and me alone. The silence was deafening. It was deafening. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me as the weight of the night's events finally took its toll. Jerry and Bard whispered to each other. I could barely hear her voice. I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back. I looked at her. My heart was aching with a mixture of love and pain. So was Barb's. I walked to the door. I paused for a moment before leaving, saying softly, Goodbye, Barb. Take care of yourself. I felt a sense of finality. Our marriage was over, and there was no going back. But in that moment, I knew it was the only way to start healing and move forward with my life. The sun was rising. As I left the bedroom, leaving Barb behind in tears, the house felt empty and the silence almost deafening. I made my way to the kitchen, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I needed to think to figure out what to do next. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the steam rising. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of anger, sadness, and confusion. How could everything have fallen apart so quickly after what felt like hours? I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me and turned to see Barb standing in the doorway. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she looked fragile and broken. Jerry, she said softly, her voice trembling, can we talk? There's not much to say, I replied, running a hand through my hair. You slept with another man. I know, she said, nodding. I'm sorry. I know, I replied. I've hurt you, and I don't know how to make it right. I know, she said, her eyes welling up with tears again. Her heart was aching. Why, Barb? Why did you do it? She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. I was lonely. Jerry, you were always busy with work, and I felt invisible. Bob made me feel noticed. I wanted it. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I regret it more than anything. She shook her head, feeling the sting. From her words, I understood that she was working for us, for our future. I never thought that she felt that way. She stepped closer, her eyes pleading. I know that she was doing it for us, and I should have talked to her and told her how I was feeling. But I didn't, and I made the worst mistake of my life. I looked down at my coffee. My mind was racing. Could we fix this? Could we ever go back to the way things were? The thought seemed impossible. Jerry, please, BB continued, her voice desperate. I still love you. I want to make this right. Can we at least try? I took a deep breath. The weight of the decision pressed down on me. I don't know, Barb. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Without trust, what do we have? She reached out her hand, trembling. We have our love, Jerry. We've been through so much together. Can't we at least try to rebuild that trust? I looked at her, seeing the pain and regret in her eyes. Part of me wanted to forgive her and believe that we could make it work, but another part of me, the part that had been betrayed, was screaming that it was too late. I need time to think. I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, I can't make this decision right now. She nodded, wiping away her tears. I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here waiting. I stood up, feeling the exhaustion in every bone of my body. I'm going to take a walk to clear my head. Bard watched me, her eyes filled with hope and fear. Okay, I'll be here when you get back. I left the house, stepping out into the cool morning air. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty. I walked aimlessly, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. My mind was racing with thoughts and emotions. Could I forgive Barb? Could we ever rebuild what we had lost? As I walked, I thought about our life together. The good times, the bad times, the moments of joy and the moments of pain. I thought about the love we had shared and the betrayal that had shattered it. By the time I returned, I had made up my mind. When I got home, the sun was high in the sky. I felt a sense of calm and clarity that had been missing before. I knew what I had to do. Barb was sitting on the couch, her eyes puffy from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "Jerry," she said softly, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath and met her gaze. Her gaze met mine. "I can't promise that things will ever be the same, but I think we owe it to ourselves to try to rebuild the trust we've lost." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of hope. "Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for giving us a chance." I nodded, feeling the weight of the decision lifting slightly. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time, but for the first time since discovering her betrayal, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Let's take it one day at a time," I said quietly, "and see where it leads us." Barb nodded, a small hopeful smile on her face. "One day at a time," she agreed, and with that, we began the difficult journey of trying to heal and rebuild the life we had once shared. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees, but for now, it was enough to know that we were both willing to try. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Barb and I were both walking on eggshells, trying to navigate the shattered pieces of our relationship. I moved into the guest bedroom, needing some space to think and heal. Barb respected my need for distance, but every interaction was tinged with sadness and regret. A week after the confrontation, I got home from work to find Barb sitting at the kitchen table. She looked up as I walked in. Her eyes were red from crying. "Hi, Jerry," she said softly. "Can we talk?" I nodded and pulled out a chair. I sat across from her. "Barb, what's on your mind?" she said. She took a deep breath. Her hands were trembling slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about us. What happened? I know I hurt you deeply and I don't expect you to forgive me easily, but I want to understand what we need to do to start healing and try and rebuild our trust." I looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. "It's not going to be easy, Barb. Trust is something that's built over time, and it was shattered in an instant." "I know," she said, her voice breaking, "but I'll do whatever it takes, Jerry. I love you. I don't want to lose you." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I love you too, Barb, but this isn't just about love. It's about trust and respect. I need to know that you're committed to making things right." She nodded vigorously. "I am, Jerry. I promise. I've already made an appointment for us with a marriage counselor. I think it could help." I was surprised by her proactive approach. "A counselor? Do you really think that will help?" She replied earnestly. "We need someone to help us communicate better and work through the pain and rebuild our foundation." I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, Barbara, I'll go, but this isn't just about talking to a counselor. It's about actions. You need to show me that you're willing to change to earn back my trust." She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. "I promise, Jerry." I took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll see one day at a time." She smiled, tears in her eyes. One day at a time. The first counseling session was awkward. We sat in the therapist's office, not knowing where to start. Dr. Harris was a kind woman. The woman, who looked to be in her 50s, started by asking us to share what had brought us there. Bard went first. She was trembling as she spoke. "I betrayed Jerry. I had an affair, and it's torn us apart. I regret it deeply and want to make things right." Dr. Harris nodded and turned to me. "How do you feel about what happened?" I took a deep breath, feeling the anger and sadness well up inside me. "I feel hurt and betrayed. I thought we had a strong marriage, but now I'm not so sure." Dr. Harris gave us both a compassionate look. Rebuilding trust after a betrayal is one of the hardest things a couple can face. It's going to take time, patience, and a lot of hard work, but if you're both committed to it, there's hope. Barb squeezed my hand, and I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could get through this. As time went by, we kept up with our counseling sessions. We talked about our feelings, our fears, and our hopes for the future. It wasn't easy. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the pain felt too overwhelming. But each time, Bard was there, willing to fight for us. One evening, after a particularly intense session, we sat on the porch watching the sunset. Bard turned to me. Her eyes were filled with determination. "Jerry, I know this is tough, but I believe in us. I believe we can get through this. Do you?" I looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "I want to, Barb. I really do, but it's going to take time. We can't rush this." She nodded, a small smile on her lips. "I know, and I'm willing to wait to put in the work because you're worth it. We're worth it." I reached out and took her hand, feeling the sense of hope for it had been a long time since we'd been able to take it one day at a time. I said it softly, and she echoed me. So we began the slow, painful process of healing. There were no guarantees, but for the first time since discovering her betrayal, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what was broken and find our way back to each other. Months had passed since the night everything fell apart. Each day had been we made progress, even if it was just a tiny step forward. The pain of Bard's betrayal was still there, but it no longer felt like a raw wound. It had started to heal slowly and painfully, but it was healing nonetheless. Barb and I kept up our counseling sessions with Dr. Harris. We talked, we cried, we argued. Through it all, we began to understand each other better. We rebuilt the trust bit by bit. One Saturday morning, I was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table when Barb joined me with 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one and sat down. "Good morning," she said with a smile. "Good morning," I replied, returning her smile. "Do you have any plans for today?" she asked, taking a sip of her coffee. "I was thinking about going for a walk in the park to clear my head," I said, shrugging. I nodded. "I was thinking about going for a walk in the park to clear my head." We finished our coffee in comfortable silence and then headed out to the park. The air was crisp and the trees were beginning to show the first hints of autumn colors. We walked side by side, our hands occasionally brushing against each other. After a while, Barb spoke up. "Jerry, I've been thinking a lot about us, about our future. I know it's been tough, and I'm really grateful that you've given us a chance to try and fix things." I glanced at her and saw the sincerity in her eyes. "It hasn't been easy, but I think we're making progress." She nodded, and a small smile played on her lips. "I feel the same way, and I want you to know that I'm committed to us, to rebuilding our trust and making our marriage stronger." "I believe," I said quietly, "but we still have a long way to go," she replied, her voice soft, but she wasn't willing to take it one step at a time with me. We continued our walk, enjoying the peacefulness of the park as we rounded a bend. We came across a small playground, where children were laughing and playing. Their joy was infectious. We watched them for a moment, and then Barb turned to me with a thoughtful expression on her face. "Jerry, do you ever think about having kids?" she asked softly. I was taken aback by the question. We had talked about starting a family before everything fell apart, but it had been put on hold after the affair. Sometimes I admitted that I used to think about it a lot, but after everything that happened, I wasn't sure if it was still possible for us. She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. It was a gentle, tentative suggestion. "Maybe not right away, but someday. I still want that with you." I looked at her, feeling the surge of hope. "I want that too, Barb. But first, we need to make sure we're strong enough to handle it." "We will be," she said with determination. "One day at a time." "Right." I smiled, squeezing her hand in return. "One day at a time." As the weeks turned into months, Barb and I continued to rebuild. We focused on communication, being honest with each other, and making time for us. It wasn't always easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but we faced them together. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Barb turned to me with a serious expression. "Jerry," she said, "there's something I need to tell you." I felt a pang of anxiety, but nodded for her to continue. "I've been offered a promotion at work," she said. "It's a great opportunity, but it would mean more travel, more time away from home." I took a deep breath, considering her words. "Do you want to take it?" She looked down at her hands, then back at me. "I do," she said, "but I'm worried about what it would mean for us. We've come so far, and I don't want to jeopardize that." I reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Barb," I said, Barb told me she'd been offered a promotion at work. It's a great opportunity, but it would mean more travel and more time away from home." I took a deep breath and considered her words. "Do you want to take it?" She looked down at her hands and then back at me. "I do, but I'm worried about what it would mean for us. We've come so far, and I don't want to jeopardize that." I reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I want you to follow your dreams. We'll figure out a way to make it work. We've already been through so much. I think we can handle this too." She smiled, relief washing over her face. "Thank you, Jerry. I needed to hear that. We'll make sure to stay connected." I added video calls and visits whenever possible. "We'll make it work." She leaned in and kissed me. It was a gesture filled with love and gratitude. "I love you, Jerry. I love you too, Barb," I replied as we sat there watching the sun dip below the horizon. I felt a sense of peace and hope for the future. We had faced the worst and come out stronger. There were still challenges ahead, but I knew we could face them together, one day at a time. We were moving on, rebuilding our life and our love. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly hopeful about the future.